Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining our Rewild Long Island webinar, The Paved Paradise, A Natural and Unnatural History of Long Island's Grasslands by Betsy McCully. I'm so happy to see you all here today. Since the last glacier retreated from Long Island, grasslands characterize the landscape of Long Island's southern half, from the vast tall grass prairie of the Hempstead Plains to the maritime grasslands of the South Fork. In this webinar, we will learn about the impacts humans since colonial times have had on the grasslands, from degradation and erasure of these ancient habitats to restoration efforts. Slides illustrate the diverse indigenous grassland flora and fauna. Betsy McCully's latest book, Land at the Glacier's Edge, A Natural History of Long Island, From the Narrows to Montauk Point, explores Long Island's natural world through her eyes as a longtime resident. The book tells the story of how the island's diverse habitats evolved and recounts the efforts of environmental activists to restore what humans have degraded. Her first book was City at the Water's Edge, A Natural History of New York. A retired professor of English at Kingsborough Community College, CUNY, she has frequently lectured on the natural and environmental history of the New York region. As writer and speaker, she hopes to inspire people to connect with nature in their home region. So without further delay, I'll hand it over to Betsy.
Thank you very much for hosting me, Rewild Long Island. I'm very excited to be sharing my talk with you, and also that it will be available in your archive. So without further delay, I think we should begin. The Paved Paradise, A Natural and Unnatural History of Long Island's Grasslands, presented by myself, Betsy McCully, on October 15th, 2024, and hosted by Rewild Long Island. Thank you, everyone, for joining me. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? They paved paradise and put up a parking lot. Joni Mitchell, second verse from The Big Yellow Taxi, 1970. Long Island's native grasslands, once extensive, are today scattered, localized remnants of what was once a vast swath that extended from Long Island to Cape Cod. The ancient grasslands have been characterized as edge of ice communities, ecological communities that evolved over the millennia after the last glacier receded some 18,000 years ago. All took root in the sandy, silty, gravelly soil of glacial outwash or terminal moraine. All harbor rare and endangered species, illustrating how the viability of a species depends on viable habitats. Long Island has, or had, I say had because one is nearly gone, two dominant types of grassland communities. The Hempstead Plains, a once vast tallgrass prairie and the only such prairie east of the Appalachians, now mostly gone, and the maritime grasslands of Long Island's South Fork, still extant, thankfully, represented by remnants at Shinnecock Hills, Conscience Point National Wildlife Refuge, Napeague and Hither Hills State Parks, Montauk Downs State Park, Shadmore State Park, Big Reed County Park, and Montauk County Park. The grasses of maritime grasslands are bunch grasses, including the dominant little blue stem, switchgrass, and purple lovegrass. There are scattered examples of other types of coastal plain grasslands on Long Island, including Sayville Grassland, Bellport Railroad, a site between the Long Island Railroad and the highway, and Calverton Grassland, located on the former Grumman Air Force site, and a bone of contention between developers and conservationists. These scattered patches occur as openings and clearings in pitch pine and mixed oak woodlands and on disturbed ground such as along a railroad, as in Bellport. All of these grasslands grow on Long Island's coastal plain in glacial deposits from the outwash plain of Long Island's southern half, a thick layer of sediment sluiced by glacial meltwaters south of the receding ice front as the glacier retreated beginning around 18,000 years ago, to the terminal moraine that characterizes most of eastern Long Island's South Fork. For my talk, I will focus mainly on our prairie, what I call our lost prairie, for its story best illustrates how our human developments have degraded and mostly erased an ancient native habitat, and how we humans can play a critical and creative role in restoring our grasslands. So let's take a closer look at the tallgrass prairie as an ecosystem. Unique to North America, tallgrass prairies evolved over millennia on glacial soils. Flat or rolling, they are composed of deep-rooted tall grasses like big blue stem that anchor the soil and form a thick turf. Historically, prairies were maintained by fire, both natural and human set, and grazing by wild herds such as bison. Beginning in the mid-1800s, European settlers on the Great Plains of the Midwest plowed the fertile prairie topsoil and planted their domesticated grasses, wheat, oats, rye, and other grains, all which grew in the deep, fertile loam and grew very well. Today, 95% of the iconic Great Plains is lost to farmland. Long Island's only tallgrass prairie, named by the English colonists as the Hempstead Plains, was not considered suitable for farming by the colonists, but it was utilized as good grazing land for their cattle. Domestic cattle grazing likely helped maintain it as prairie, coupled with periodic wildflowers. Historically, it was no doubt maintained by a prescribed fire regime practiced since time immemorial by the Algonquins, the original New Yorkers or Long Islanders, known as the Lenapes, now called Delaware. Thousands of years before European settlement, the Hempstead Prairie evolved on glacial outwash after the last glacier receded. Is considered a climax ecosystem, one that would have remained a prairie forever if not for development. It may once have been part of a continuous band of sand plain grasslands extending from New Jersey to Massachusetts. It differs from the maritime grasslands in that it is an inland prairie, not subject to maritime influences like salt air and sea winds. The Hempstead Plains has been mapped and documented in numerous sources, from colonial promotional tracts to Revolution-era British war maps to travelers' accounts of the 1700s to Long Islanders' memoirs of the early 1800s to botanical surveys of the early 1900s. It once spanned an estimated 50 to 60,000 acres and has now been reduced to 24 acres, if we can even call these patches true tallgrass prairie because they have been so severely disturbed. Let's hear the words of contemporaries who described the plains they encountered centuries ago. Reverend Daniel Denton, a Presbyterian minister and resident Long Islander, extolled Long Island's, quote, land of milk and honey in a promotional tract he published in 1670. Quote, toward the middle of the island lieth a plain, 16 miles long and 4 broad, upon which plain grows very fine grass that makes good pasture for sheep and cattle, where you shall find neither stick nor stone to hinder a horse's heels. Here, Anyone may furnish himself and live rent-free, yea, with such quantity of land that he may weary himself with walking over his fields of corn and all sorts of grain, and for the cattle grass as high as a man's knees, nay, as high as his waist. If there be any terrestrial Canaan, 'tis surely here, where the land floweth with milk and honey. Note his biblical allusions. As a promoter of English settlement, he evoked an American Eden, with land virtually free for the taking. Never mind its having been settled and sustainably used by the original peoples for thousands of years. Almost 2 centuries later, another clergyman and Long Islander, Nathaniel Prime, described the plains he traveled through in 1845 as, quote, smooth and unbroken as the surface of the sea in a calm, though as you pass over it you meet with slight undulations, and the views of the traveler over the whole expanse is unobstructed by tree or shrub or any other vegetable production. Within the memory of persons still living, there was scarcely an enclosure in this whole compass. He noted, too, that it could not be farmed because of its quote-unquote gravelly substratum. A contemporary of Prime, the poet Walt Whitman, also a Long Islander, recalled his boyhood ambles in the early 1800s through what he described as the, quote, quite prairie-like plains, open, uninhabited, where cattle fed there by the hundreds, even thousands, and at evening might be seen taking their way home, branching regularly in the right places. I have often been out on the edges of these plains towards sundown, and can yet recall in fancy the interminable cow processions, and hear the music of the tin and copper bells clanking far or near. By the time Whitman penned his nostalgic lines, the plains was already being eyed by developers with very different kinds of fancies than those of Whitman. Where Whitman saw in his mind's eye an idyllic pastoral scene, developers saw a desert that in their mind's eye would, quote, blossom with houses. In 1869, department store magnate Alexander Turney Stewart purchased 7,000 acres of the plains to build his utopian working-class suburb of Garden City, touted by Harper's Weekly in Edenic terms. Quote, Hempstead Plains, hitherto a desert, will be made to blossom as the rose. It will be the most beautiful suburb in the vicinity of New York. Godspeed the undertaking. Stewart's working-class suburb never materialized, perhaps due to its rental arrangement. After all, the dream was to become a homeowner, a dream extolled by Whitman himself, who said, a man is not a whole and complete man until he owns a house and the ground it stands on. Whitman was lucky to have grown up in a house in Huntington, Long Island. Despite his idealization of American home ownership, I believe he would have been dismayed by the piece-by-piece carving up of the ancient plains that was coming. In 1946, the Levitt brothers bought and subdivided Stewart's home estate, Island Trees, to build what they envisioned as a suburb for post-war GIs. By 1960, they had built over 17,000 homes in Levittown. With expanding suburbs came cars and highways and malls. In 1956, William Zeckendorf built Roosevelt Field Mall on 360 acres of remaining prairie. One of the earliest malls dubbed by Architectural Forum as, quote, markets in the meadows. And they were not being ironic. The name Roosevelt Field reminds us of the earlier uses of the plains as airfields, beginning in the early 1900s. Roosevelt Airfield was one of the aviation sites built on the plains in the early days of civilian air travel. The relatively flat and treeless terrain of the plains was ideal for airfields, and their active use ironically preserved the grassland as such for decades. Mitchell Field, originally in 1917 Hazelhurst Aviation Airfield, was long used as an Army training base and later as a U.S. Air Defense Command base, indicative of Central Long Island's importance in the aerospace industry. In 1960, Mitchell Field was turned over to Nassau County and is now the site of Nassau County Museum, Nassau County Community College, Nassau County Coliseum, and other large complexes, some still on paper and subject to considerable controversy as the area becomes overdeveloped, and what's left of the plains in peril of complete erasure. It is in Mitchell Field where a fragment of the original tallgrass prairie, that is the least disturbed example, can still be found. It's thanks to the assiduous efforts and vision of eco-restorationists like Betsy McCully that we have anything of the plains left at all. Under McCully's leadership, the Friends of Hempstead Plains organized themselves in 2001 and through their persistent and tireless efforts established the Hempstead Plains Preserve on a 19-acre parcel of land at Nassau Community College, where McCully was a professor. Restoration of the highly disturbed grassland was and continues to be a work of love and hard work. It entailed burning and rooting out non-native invasive flora and reseeding with native flora. Removal of invasives was sometimes necessary if plants could not be reseeded because the removal of invasives gave them the space to grow, as long as the seeds were present in the soil, which in many cases was itself highly disturbed and degraded. So soil restoration had to be part of the effort also. The sandplain Gerardia, now called Agellinus decimloba, best illustrates the success of such grassland restoration and recovery projects like that at Hempstead Plains Preserve. This delicate flower once stained our grasslands amethyst in late summer, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, then virtually disappeared. Now the largest colony grows in Mitchell Field. The second largest grows in another preserved grassland, Sayville Grassland. Not a prairie, but with the little bluestem the Agellinus needs to grow. For this flower apparently forms a hemiparasitic relationship with the roots of the little bluestem. It is thanks to the efforts of Marilyn Jordan of the Nature Conservancy, who monitored the flower's fortunes from 1992 until 2003, when she issued a report on its status, that the flower has made a comeback. She wrote in her report that it's not a flower you can just plant in your backyard. It needs a whole, viable habitat, a healthy grassland with little bluestem to thrive. Habitat preservation, eco-restoration was and is absolutely key to saving this rare flower and the 9 others that the prairie and other Long Island grasslands host. These include New England blazing star and birdfoot violet, both rare and endangered plants. Suburbanization brought not only highways, malls, and parking lots, miles and miles of pavement, but lawns. You may protest, But lawns are green, aren't they? Let's look at the history of lawns on Long Island. The lawn was an artificial concept borrowed from 18th century English landscape designers and adopted by American landowners who aspired to be like the English gentry with their country estates. Historically, it was maintained by sheep grazing and intense human labor, hired men who wielded scythes to maintain the lawn. With the invention of the lawn mower in the early 1800s, coupled with the expansion of middle-class suburbs starting in the late 1800s and spreading like wildfire after World War II, lawns became ubiquitous and often required by community ordinances. For example, Levittown's covenant required homeowners to mow their lawns once a week. If they neglected their duties, Abraham Levitt himself would dispatch his own gardeners to mow the negligent neighbor's lawn and bill him for the cost. Abraham, the patriarch of the Levitt family, wrote a weekly column in the Levittown newsletter, which went out to 17,544 houses, in which he extolled the virtues of lawns. Quote, "Lawns, like all living things, require care." And he offered step-by-step instructions on how to maintain them. But even he, not wanting to discourage homeowners put off by the cost and time and money by lawn keeping, later modified his tune. "Even our lowly weeds, which are just other native grasses, if kept cut to not more than 2 inches, help to green carpet the lawn." Abe died in 1962. One wonders what he would have thought or said had he known of the environmental costs of lawn care. The cost of such care was and continues to be enormous, both to the environment and other species with whom we share our habitats, and to the homeowners themselves. It's not just about mowing, although gasoline-powered mowers and blowers today exact a huge environmental toll. Beginning in the 1940s, as a legacy of World War II and to the profit of petrochemical industries, toxic chemicals were sprayed with abandon to keep those lawns green. Pesticides and herbicides were both applied to maintain that perfect lawn. Rachel Carson, in her landmark book Silent Spring, published in 1962, documented the use of more than 200 toxic organochlorine chemicals developed since the mid-1940s to kill unwanted plants and animals in farm fields and home gardens. The pesticide DDT, originally developed to kill unwanted pests on farm fields and wetlands, was introduced in 1945 for use in home gardens by home gardeners. It was used precisely because it persisted in the soil, and because of this quality, it built up in the tissues of animals up the food chain, from insects to fish to birds. The eggshells of top of the food chain avian predators like eagles and ospreys were so thin their chicks would not hatch, and the birds teetered on the edge of extinction. Largely as a result of Carson sounding the alarm about such widespread, indiscriminate use of toxic chemicals and their impact not only on our fellow species but on our own bodies, DDT was finally banned on Long Island in 1966 and nationwide in 1972. To quote Carson from Silent Spring, "Can anyone believe it is possible to lay down such a barrage of poisons on the surface of the earth without making it unfit for all life? They should not be called insecticides, but biocides. Hey, farmer, farmer, put away that DDT now. Give me spots on my apples. Leave me the birds and the bees, please. Thank you, Joni Mitchell, for your song, The Big Yellow Taxi. What have we lost by erasing true grasslands? Let's consider the life of a viable native habitat like a healthy grassland. Leave me the birds and bees, please. Grassland birds, that is, those that need grasslands to breed, are among the largest group of rapidly declining avian species. As their habitats shrink, so too have the populations of grassland birds. Long Island was once the summer home of bobolinks, to mention just one of our once common grassland nesting birds. I have to travel upstate to find them where they breed, and then only in grasslands that have been preserved or restored or created, as in the case of the Shongunks grassland. A disused military airport in Ulster County, the 597-acre parcel became a National Wildlife Refuge in 1999, a unit of the Wallkill River National Wildlife Refuge. The parcel is large enough to support breeding populations of grassland birds, including grasshopper and vesper sparrows, horned larks, short-eared owls, and bobolinks. It's a joy to me to see the bobolinks displaying, rising above the tall grasses and flashing their white epaulets and tails, singing a high-pitched twittering song as they do so, impressing their potential female mates. Or, if you listen closely, to hear the sweet tinkling music of a meadowlark calling. Swing your binoculars toward that music and you may see it sporting its bright gold and black plumage while singing from atop a shrub or fence post. It should be noted that the Shongunks grassland was not an original grassland. It was in fact a swamp that was filled in by the U.S. Army in the 1940s to make an airfield. You don't need an original grassland to make a grassland. You can take an old airfield or farm field and maintain it as grassland by mowing, timed, of course, to be outside of nesting periods for breeding birds, and by prescribed fire, where possible, to keep it from becoming a successional field that becomes wooded again. Another example is closer to home, Calverton Grasslands, a parcel of 800 acres in Long Island's central Pine Barrens, where the Navy's Grumman Airfield used to be, and which eco-activists have saved so far from development, but it's an ongoing battle against development interests. Here I have heard and seen not only the meadowlark, but the little grasshopper sparrow. The day I visited in July, he was singing atop a cedar tree. It's not a beautiful song, and he's rather a plain bird, but even its insect-like song is music to my ears. The grasshopper sparrow once bred mainly in tallgrass prairie, but he has adapted to other types of grasslands, such as the successional grassland of Calverton. Similarly, the bobolink once bred mainly in tallgrass prairies, but has adapted to a wider range of grasslands, including hay fields, as I've witnessed in the Hudson Valley. Here I will share a sad experience. An old historical farmstead in the Hudson Valley had been bought by a family from New York City and preserved, both farmhouse and hay fields, all to the good at first glance. The bobolinks and meadowlarks singing and displaying in the hay fields, where the grasses grew waist high, drew birders and nature lovers from far and wide. I visited on a day in late June of this year and felt a surge of hope at seeing these grassland birds thriving in their natural habitats. Unfortunately, a few days later, weeks before their nesting was finished and young birds fledged, the tenant farmers mowed the hayfields. When I heard this, it was heartbreaking. Why can we not see ourselves as dwellers in the land, not on the land? Dwellers who share our habitats with other species, as members of larger eco-communities. Imagine if the concept of preservation extended beyond historical properties and houses and even open space to the habitats within which they are located. Open space, quote unquote, is not empty space, but a habitat, a home for many species. Farmers can play a crucial role in preserving grasslands for breeding birds, and many already do so, timing their mowing of hayfields to bird breeding schedules. Many farmers, in fact, are becoming part of the growing rewilding movement across the country, from the Midwestern prairies, where working farmers are setting aside, quote, prairie strips adjacent to their croplands, to our New York farmers. Farmers had the land acreage needed to support breeding birds, and they soon discovered that once they rewild a portion of their land, the benefits extend to their croplands. The deep-rooted native grasses and forbs of prairies, for example, serve to control soil erosion and runoff, fix beneficial microbes in the soil, and attract beneficial pollinators. By restoring, even creating to the extent we can, native habitats like the grasslands that once covered much of the southern half of Long Island, we restore whole ecosystems, ones that include not only plants, but birds and other animals, including our insect pollinators. Pollinators, like all insects throughout the planet, are experiencing a steep decline. Why? Habitat loss, climate change, and indiscriminate applications of insecticides and herbicides. Some call it an insect apocalypse. Most of us think of butterflies and honeybees as pollinators, but there are others. Let's look at a few of them, which, unlike the imported honeybees, are native species. Flower flies, of which there are estimated to be 900 species in North America, are important pollinators. Also called hoverflies because of their way of hovering over a flower, these flies feed on nectar and pollen, and also predate insect pests such as aphids. Their striped abdomens mimic bees, but they are distinguished from them by having one set of wings instead of two sets. Sweat bees, many metallic in coloration like this lovely little green one, are small bees that collect pollen and nectar to feed their larvae. Most are ground nesters and serve as important pollinators for many different types of crops. Bumblebees are known as buzz pollinators because they buzz their wings to dislodge pollen from the flower. Cold tolerant, they are one of the first pollinators to emerge in spring. More than a quarter of our North American bumblebees are at risk of extinction. The most iconic of our butterfly pollinators is, of course, the monarch. Individuals of our eastern populations migrate several thousand miles round trip between Mexico and Canada, completing their journey in a year, with the third or fourth generation making the return trip to Mexico in fall. They depend on flower nectar to fuel their journeys. Both the western and eastern populations of this migratory butterfly are declining. The western population is now on the red watch list of endangered species, and the eastern population has declined by 90% in 20 years. These butterflies are specialists in the sense that their larvae feed on milkweed plants, and many a home gardener and farmer can help them by providing milkweed stands. But this alone has proved to be not enough to stem the drastic population declines. Farmers, landscapers, and home gardeners need to refrain from indiscriminate applications of broad spectrum insecticides and herbicides, especially the class of neurotoxic insecticides called neonics, which, like DDT, is persistent. That is, it remains in the soil for years. Every time you see a plastic yellow flag stuck into a neighbor's lawn, you are being informed and warned that a toxic biocide has been applied to their lawn. These signs are all too ubiquitous. I'd like the pollinators to come to my garden, please. Grasslands are habitats, complex webs of interdependent species. We humans are part of nature's web. Whether original or human altered, all grasslands, whatever patches remain, must be preserved. Our yards can be reimagined as habitats, no matter the size. If your site fits a native habitat, whether grassland, woodland, wetland, you can grow native plants that thrive in your garden. You can avoid invasive plants that alter native habitats. If you refrain from using pesticides and herbicides, you can have a pollinator-friendly garden. You can keep your lawn small and grow grasses and other green ground covers native to the region. Imagine a little wildflower meadow or pollinator garden in your backyard. Imagine the array of lovely flowers you could grow, like these that grow in Long Island grasslands, pollinator gardens, and wildflower meadows. And I will name a few of them. The yellow wild indigo, which is the host plant for the critically imperiled frosted elfin, shown on the upper left corner. American boneset, toothed white-topped aster, New England aster, all fall blooming, beautiful fall blooming plants, New England blazing star, and blue vervain. Please note that all these flowers I photographed in the wild, and they serve as a reminder that flowers should never be dug from the wild, but should be obtained from nurseries whose native plants are ethically sourced or grown from seed. Rewild Long Island, for example, offers seasonal sales of native plants, as well as a list of sources for seeds and plants. Gardeners, just imagine rolling up that sod like an old rug and putting away those cans of chemicals, disposing them responsibly, of course. Landscapers and town natural resource managers and planners, just imagine unpaving that parking lot and putting up a grassland. Just imagine. I'd like to conclude by reading a passage from my book. My book is called At the Glacier's Edge, A Natural History of Long Island. I'll be reading an anecdote about monarchs, milkweeds, a local farm, and a surprise ladybug from Chapter 6. Perhaps it is anecdotal, but I can only attest to the dramatic drop in numbers of monarchs observed along the Long Island coast in fall migration. I recall decades ago, the 1980s, how they draped the coastal goldenrods so thickly they turned the golden flowers orange and bent them down with their combined weight. And this was not in a country field, but in a Brooklyn neighborhood where goldenrods grew in an undeveloped patch along an esplanade. Perhaps those flowers were like an oasis in an urban desert to them, and they became concentrated on this small stand of goldenrod. When a new house was built and the esplanade became privatized in the 1990s, the owners apparently decided, if they gave any thought to it at all, that goldenrods were weeds and had to go. But no matter where I wander on Long Island, whether in an urban park or country field, I now feel lucky to see 1, 2, 3 in a season. A few years ago, organic farmer Scott Chasky, then director of the community farm of Quail Hill in Amagansett, turned over an entire field to milkweed. But defying the adage that if you build it, they will come, precious few came and laid their eggs on them. The milkweed planted at Quail Hill may not have drawn the numbers of monarchs hoped for, but it did attract an endangered beetle, and that was hopeful. The 9-spotted ladybug, a once common ladybug named the New York State insect in 1989 for its valued role in suppressing insect pests, was thought to be locally extinct by 2006, when it was proposed in the state legislature the beetle be replaced as the state insect. But on a July day in 2011, a volunteer in Cornell University's Lost Ladybug Project was surveying Chasky's field of milkweed. This little bug was clearly different from the larger red milkweed beetles that often cover the leaves and pods and are considered a noxious pest by those who want healthy stands of milkweed. This one had 4 spots on each wing and a spot split in the middle, the object of the lost ladybug quest. That summer, 20 more were found on the farm. It was drawn to the milkweed not as a food source, but as a host for aphids and other bugs that are the ladybug's food sources, a whole ecosystem in a flower. Healthy native grasslands support a diversity of native flowering plants. The more croplands replace grasslands and farmers eradicate weeds and insects with spraying of herbicides and insecticides, the more species are lost. The loss of a beetle is about more than its economic and utilitarian value as a natural controller of pests. The loss of a butterfly is about more than its aesthetic value as a thing of beauty. The loss of a grassland is about more than its environmental value as open space or even its ecological value as native habitat. All these losses, one by one in a cascade of losses, unravel the very fabric of nature and diminish us. Thank you for joining me for my webinar. If you'd like to learn more about New York's natural history, its habitats and species, please read my book, At the Glacier's Edge, A Natural History of Long Island from the Narrows to Montauk Point, and visit my website, newyorknature.us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Betsy. That was so informative. And I'm just so happy that a few of the plants you showed are in my garden, and it's just so wonderful to see them and what they can do for the environment.
That's wonderful to hear that they're in your garden. I love that. And I hope the pollinators are there too.
Yes, I love them all. Even the milkweed beetle.
Yeah.
They are very, very happy in my garden. If anybody have questions, you are welcome to pop them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and speak up and ask your question. Ask away. Betsy is here for the night.
I'll just start with, this is Len Green, and I just want to say, Betsy, thank you so much. That was really beautiful. I mean, the images as well as the text and your presentation. I just wanted to make a comment, I guess, that, as you know, out of here in East Hampton, as part of what you're advocating, our sister group, Change Hampton, has gotten permission from the East Hampton town government to put in a grassland type planting at Town Hall. And we're hoping that it will become a model for other townships to use their campuses to show the public just what can be done with a grassland planting. I assume you're aware of this, and do you have any thoughts about it?
Oh, I love the idea. I'm so glad it's being done. And that's a perfect example. When I addressed in my conclusion, toward the end of the talk, town planners, environment, natural resources managers, and so on. What do you, I could have gone on, of course, what do you do with that open space around those buildings? Is open space is wonderful. We love preserving open space, but I tried to make that point that open space is also a habitat. It's not empty space. So I just love that you there. And we can't do the kind of grasslands that require hundreds of acres to support the breeding grassland birds that I mentioned, but we certainly can provide native plants that attract the native pollinators and respect it and build. Really, we're rebuilding it as habitat and respect it as habitat. I just love it. Thank you for mentioning that.
And I would just add that this is an example of what advocacy can do. It took, and they didn't volunteer to do this. We had to go to them and we advocated, we presented our plans, we argued, we reasoned, and they acquiesced. So I would just suggest to anyone out there listening to this webinar, please go to your town government, go to your municipalities and ask them, what are you doing with this big wasteful expanse of lawn on your town campus? You can change that into something really beautiful and attractive.
Absolutely. Yes.
And environmentally friendly.
Yeah. Yeah, advocacy is absolutely key, and it's grass. Speaking of grass, it's grassroots advocacy. It has to begin from the grassroots. That's the only way things get done. That's the only way Calverton Grasslands has been preserved, and it's an ongoing fight. It is literally a fight. Maybe not with already preserved space that the town owns. Or has jurisdiction, but it's certainly a fight when land is in contention, as it is at Calverton Grasslands, where you've got developers swarming in and wanting to, they had all kinds of ideas from amusement parks to, yes, truly, developments of all kinds. Yes, it's always something you must advocate for, and you do it with passion and persistence.
Yeah, this is Nancy. I'd just like to add that kind of a similar thought that we have audience members and Rewild members from all over Long Island, and it's great to get to know your local municipality and your local government and just keep coming and talking to them. They usually have open hours. And I'm going to write to our town board and say, hey, watch this webinar. You're talking about grasslands, and this is going to really show you in depth like how important an ecological benefit a grassland can be and how small it can be. Because I think all towns have some what they would consider like waste grounds that are maybe overrun with invasive plants, and instead of mowing them, they if people get together and convince their local mayor or their local town council, they could have something much more fruitful, like a grassland.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Are there any other questions out there? Or just comments to share your own experiences?
Yes, Tara was saying that it's so heartbreaking to realize what has been lost.
Yes,
yes. I was not realizing how big the original grassland was.
Yes.
And so it is heartbreaking.
It is, and I think that that sense of loss can be overwhelming. But we can try to take that emotion and that feeling and turn it into, as Lynn said, advocacy. We are advocating not for something, not just for something we feel passionate about. We are advocating for the earth. We are advocating for the land. The land can't speak for itself. Butterflies can't speak for themselves. Pollinators, flowers, habitats can't speak for themselves. So this is, of course, what I'm trying to do in my book is to give voice to the land. And this is what we must think of trying to do, take that sense of loss and turn it into a more creative energy that we can create. As I pointed out in the examples of creating not Calverton, that was already, that's successional grassland, but the Shongongs, for example, was a created grassland. And again, that was through local advocacy, not only that the government already was using it as an airfield, but it did take, again, grassroots organization, activists, I call them eco-activists, to make this happen. So, and keep it as grassland. Yeah, it's a beautiful place. Yeah. And I should add, in my example of the Hudson Valley Farm, where I truly felt stressed, and many people did, over the mowing of the hayfield, when you had the bobolinks and meadowlarks actually mating and nesting there. That was just heartbreaking, but it was a reminder also that there is a role private landowners can play. And there are a number who have, whether farmers or those who are simply preserving open space, and they may start out with this great intention of preserving open space, not quite understanding that whole concept of what an open space is other than open green space. But to think of it, they need to just rethink, okay, this is a habitat and we are trying to take care of it. That means taking care of the plants, the animals, the species, the whole living web of which we are a part. So, yes.
That is very well said. Thank you so much again for this very informative webinars, and we've learned so much. And hopefully this would encourage more homeowners to put in grasslands into their gardens.
Or at least a little wildflower meadow pollinator garden. It doesn't have to be huge, it can be small. Yes. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you again. And thank you everyone for joining us.